There are friendships that begin so early, in circumstances so ordinary, that neither person involved has any way of knowing what they are actually standing at the beginning of. Two schoolboys sharing a bus route through the streets of Liverpool in 1954 would have had no frame of reference for understanding that what was beginning between them in those daily commutes, the conversations about music, the shared fascination with what was coming through the radio, the way they recognized something in each other that the people around them did not quite have, was going to shape the soundtrack of the 20th century. Paul McCartney has been breaking his silence about George Harrison, incrementally and across decades, in the specific way that people talk about someone they loved and could not always reach and lost before the conversation was complete. What he has said, assembled from interviews and memoirs and the occasional unguarded moment in a documentary, adds up to a portrait of a relationship that was genuinely difficult and genuinely irreplaceable in equal measure, and that ended with the two of them holding hands in a New York hospital room in a way that, as Paul later observed, two young men from Liverpool would never have done in the years when the world was watching them. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, and George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, making them about 8 months apart in age and 1 year apart in school at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, where they shared a bus route that became the first extended context in which their friendship developed. Paul's father, Jim McCartney, had led a jazz band in the 1920s, and music was a presence in the McCartney household from the beginning, something Paul absorbed before he consciously chose it. By his early teenage years he had already moved through piano and found his way to guitar, the instrument that would define the rest of his life. George Harrison was a different kind of boy, quieter and by his own later admission deeply unhappy at school. He described his time at the Liverpool Institute as the worst period of his life, chafing against the uniformity and the strict requirements that felt, to someone of his particular temperament, like a confinement rather than an education. What both boys shared, and what gave the bus conversations their direction, was an absolute captivation by the music that was arriving from America and transforming what young people in Britain thought was possible. The skiffle craze that was running through the United Kingdom in the mid-1950s told young people directly that professional training was not a prerequisite for making music. You needed an instrument and some fire and people willing to make noise with you, and that was more or less sufficient. Both McCartney and Harrison had also fallen for the American artists who were simultaneously remaking the landscape of popular music. George Harrison has described the moment he first heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel coming out of a window on a Liverpool street as a complete and total stop. An instant in which everything that had been possible before was replaced by something that felt categorically more alive. He filled school notebooks with drawings of guitars. He practiced chords until his fingers hurt. By 1956, he had put together a small skiffle group with his brother and a friend that he called the Rebels, which was not an accidental choice of name. Paul had joined a band called the Quarrymen by 1957, led by a slightly older boy named John Lennon, and when the group began looking for another guitar player, Paul thought of George. John Lennon was not immediately convinced. He found George too young and too small to take seriously as a musician. What changed his mind was a performance on the top deck of a Liverpool bus, where George played a clean and note-perfect version of a rockabilly song called Raunchy by Bill Justice. Lennon listened and could not argue with what he heard. Harrison was in. With that, the core of what would become the most successful group in the history of recorded popular music was assembled, and the friendship between Paul and George, which had begun in those ordinary daily commutes, was formalized into a creative partnership that would last for the rest of their lives, with all of the friction and loyalty and unresolved tension that the phrase creative partnership contains. In the years of practice and small venues and the slow accumulation of a following that preceded the explosion of Beatlemania, Paul operated as something like an older brother figure to George, who was nearly a year younger and who looked up to Paul in ways that Paul did not always fully register. The dynamic was genuinely warm in that period, grounded in shared obsession and shared ambition and the specific bond of people who have chosen the same improbable dream. But the nature of that dynamic also contained the seed of the tensions that would emerge once the group became famous. Paul's natural authority, his creative confidence and his relentless drive to push the work forward were enormously valuable to the Beatles as a productive force. To George, standing inside that creative environment day after day and year after year, those same qualities eventually began to feel like a constriction, a reduction of the available space for what he had to say and to contribute. By the time of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, The asymmetry had become impossible for Harrison to ignore. The album was largely McCartney's project, a high-concept theatrical record built around Paul's vision and driven by his energy. George's contribution to the entire record was a single track, Within You Without You, which drew on the deep engagement with Indian music and Eastern philosophy that had been growing in him for several years and that meant something genuinely personal to him. The making of the album was, for George, a sustained experience of watching his creative voice be treated as peripheral while Paul's vision drove everything. It was not that anyone set out to diminish him. It was structural, built into how the group operated, and by 1967 it had been operating that way long enough that George had developed a clear understanding of his own position within it. The trip to India in 1968 to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi brought the philosophical distance between Paul and George into direct and personal focus. For Harrison, the experience was among the most significant of his life. He had been moving toward Eastern philosophy for years, and the time in India felt like an arrival rather than a detour. Paul was interested but experienced the retreat with considerably less depth, and at some point made a light joke to George suggesting he relax and stop taking things so seriously. George did not find it funny. The joke landed as a dismissal of something that was more important to him than almost anything else he was engaged with at that point in his life, and it widened a gap between them that was already wide. The breaking point that the cameras captured came during the rehearsals and recording sessions for what would become the Let It Be film and album. In footage that is now widely known, Paul can be seen explaining to George exactly how he thinks a guitar part should be played, in a way that George found condescending and suffocating. Harrison told Paul he would play whatever Paul wanted, but the exchange was brief and uncomfortable and documented the underlying dynamic in a way that extended conversation had obscured. On January 10, 1969, Harrison walked out of the sessions. He did not make a statement in the moment. He simply left. It was only later that he described the experience of remaining in the band as deeply unhealthy and deeply unhappy for him. The other Beatles were shaken. They eventually persuaded him to return 12 days later, but Harrison was clear that something had changed permanently and would not change back. In a private conversation documented from that period, Paul admitted to John Lennon that George's songwriting had reached a level at least as good as theirs. Paul made this observation in a way that suggested genuine surprise, as if he were recognizing something for the first time that had in fact been true for considerable time. When Harrison became aware of this comment, it did not move him toward gratitude or toward a sense of having finally been acknowledged. It moved him toward something closer to sadness, because what it confirmed was that he had been producing meaningful and accomplished work for years within an environment that had never made adequate room for it, and that the people who should have recognized it had taken until late in the band's existence to notice something he had been offering all along. When the Beatles broke apart in 1970, George Harrison put into All Things Must Pass everything he had been holding back across the years of the band. The album was a triple record, an enormous outpouring of songs that had been rejected or ignored during recording sessions while the Lennon-McCartney partnership took precedence. All Things Must Pass is widely considered one of the great albums of its era, and its existence was a demonstration of what had been being excluded. Harrison then organized the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, one of the first major benefit concerts in rock history. He invited Paul to participate. Paul said no. The refusal was absorbed by George as another wound, another data point in a pattern that had been accumulating since the early years of the band. Through the 1970s, the relationship between them was conducted largely through interviews in which each occasionally took aim at the other with varying degrees of directness. In one instance that Paul later acknowledged hurt him considerably, George said he could imagine playing music again someday with John Lennon but not with Paul. The comment was public and deliberate and communicated clearly where Harrison stood at that point in the aftermath of everything. Paul described hearing it as genuinely painful, not because he was surprised that tensions existed between them but because of the specific weight of that statement coming from someone he had known since they were schoolboys on a bus. Time wore down the sharpest edges, as time tends to, and by the early 1990s something had shifted enough that they could occupy the same room without igniting the old battles. What brought them together properly was the Anthology project, and specifically the sessions in February 1994 in which Paul, George, and Ringo Starr gathered at McCartney's studio to complete recordings that John Lennon had left behind. The songs Free as a Bird and Real Love were built around Lennon's demo recordings, and working on them put the three surviving Beatles in the position of doing something for John that connected back to the deepest roots of what the four of them had shared. Harrison insisted that his close friend Jeff Lynne produce the sessions, and warned Paul directly that without a neutral presence in the room, things could easily turn difficult. Paul later acknowledged that George had been entirely right about this. They argued during those sessions about guitar parts and lyrics, and what the project was fundamentally supposed to be. Paul wanted the completed songs to sound recognizably like the Beatles at their most identifiable. George preferred something quieter and more intimate. Every disagreement was real, and every disagreement was eventually worked through, and what came out of the sessions was music that Paul described as having given him back something he had not expected to find. In working through those creative differences with George, they rebuilt a small but genuine bridge back to the early friendship, the one that had existed before the machinery of the most famous band in history had complicated everything between them. Harrison's health began failing seriously in the late 1990s. Throat cancer was diagnosed in 1997. Lung cancer followed. A brain tumor was eventually also identified. In December 1999, an intruder broke into his home and attacked him with a knife, a traumatic incident that left him physically weakened at a time when his health was already seriously compromised. Paul visited during those final years, and both men spoke about the experience of being with each other in that context in terms that acknowledged how the long history between them looked different when filtered through the reality of what they were facing. Paul described it as a situation in which the things that had once seemed so important began to look very small. One of the last times Paul sat with George was in a New York hospital room. They spent hours together, talking and laughing about small things in the way they had as boys, and at some point they held hands. Paul has described this detail with the observation that in the years when they were young men from Liverpool, neither of them would ever have done that. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, in accordance with his wishes. In the years since George's death, Paul McCartney has spoken about him with a consistent and increasing candor that reflects both genuine grief and genuine reckoning. He has acknowledged publicly that he underestimated George, that he did not always see him clearly during the years when they were working together, and that George was producing work of real significance during the Beatles' era that was not given the space it deserved. In an interview with the BBC, McCartney said that George was a most poetic person, in many ways the most poetic, and that he was very lucky to know him and very lucky to make music with him. He has described something, the Harrison song from Abbey Road, as one of the great love songs of the 20th century. A song that Frank Sinatra famously performed regularly and credited to Lennon and McCartney before correcting himself to name Harrison. Paul has acknowledged that Sinatra was not alone in undervaluing the songwriting. The undervaluation was structural and systemic, and he was part of it. Outside the formal interviews, Paul has maintained a more private acknowledgement of what George meant to him. He keeps a fir tree that Harrison once gave him, planted near the gate of his home, and has described the habit of saying hello to his late friend when he passes it. George's son Donnie and Paul's daughter Stella McCartney have remained genuinely close, carrying forward in their friendship something of the warmth that existed between their fathers before the rivalry and the distance complicated it. That generational continuity represents a kind of resolution that Paul and George themselves never fully achieved, but that exists as a consequence of what was real between them underneath everything that made it difficult. What Paul McCartney has been saying about George Harrison, across decades of interviews and reflections and the occasional documentary appearance, amounts to a testimony to the specific quality of friendships that are formed in childhood and then subjected to every pressure that extraordinary success can generate. Those friendships do not end cleanly. They accumulate complexity until the accumulated weight of it makes simple affection difficult to access, and sometimes the people in them go years without being able to say directly what they mean to each other. Paul was honest about this in his 2021 memoir The Lyrics, in which he discussed both the depth of what the Beatles meant to him and the difficulties of the relationships that made the band what it was. He did not attempt to resolve the contradictions into something cleaner than they actually were. He described things as they had been, which is the only honest way to describe them. The phrase that Paul has returned to most consistently when speaking about George, in various forms across many years of interviews, is some version of the acknowledgement that he did not always see him clearly. It is a statement about vision and about the specific blindness that familiarity can produce in people who have known each other for decades and who have accumulated enough history that they sometimes relate to who they think the other person is rather than who that person has actually become. Paul saw a younger boy he had mentored, and then a junior partner in a creative hierarchy, and then a difficult colleague. George, across the same period, was becoming one of the most thoughtful and accomplished musicians of his generation. Someone whose spiritual seriousness and whose songwriting depth were real and documented, and consistently undervalued by the structure he was working within. When Paul says he did not always see George clearly, he is admitting that he was looking at a version of George that had been formed in the early days of their relationship, and that he failed to fully update as George grew into someone larger and more significant than the original version. It is the kind of admission that takes decades to arrive at, and that, once made, cannot be unmade. Paul McCartney has been making it, quietly and in pieces, for more than 20 years.